Welcome, folks, from all over the world. It's another fine Monday morning here, and you know what that means. It's time for the on.net live show, where our mission is to empower you, the .NET community, to achieve more. I'm your host, Scott Addy, joined by co-host Luis Quintanilla. We are stoked to have today's guest join us. Folks, please give a virtual clap and round of applause for our guest, Garrett London, who is a technical enablement architect at Postman. Garrett, would you like to briefly introduce yourself beyond what I just provided?
Sure. Thank you very much. So as you said, I'm a technical enablement architect at Postman, and basically what we do is we're a bunch of ex-software engineers, current software engineers that were brought on into the field services organization to solve complex business problems and basically create cool solutions with a wide variety of languages, frameworks, tools, pretty much everything. So I prepared a talk today called Safely Sprinting with Blazor, and this kind of ties into the driving API quality with Postman and .NET talk, because I want to take us on a journey from a line of business application that is a kind of a proof of concept, right? Don't know if it's gonna really work out, and then transition us into a full-fledged enterprise that actually needs a dedicated API program and a API program with a high level of quality. So just a little background about myself. First couple of years of my career was spent developing .NET Core Web APIs in the financial services sector. Then moved on to Postman and been at Postman ever since. So very excited to be talking about Blazor, very excited to be talking about Azure, Postman, .NET, pretty much everything Microsoft. So let's get into it.
Sounds good. Yeah, very similar background here. Came from financial services, developing APIs. It's a small world. Let's get right into the presentation. And folks, as a reminder, if you have questions for Garrett as he's presenting, please put those in chat and we'll do our best to get to those.
Great. So just to set the frame, we are going to start, we're developing a small line of business application, trying to prove out a concept. We need to iterate rapidly. And we want to choose a technology that actually allows us to do that. So I'm going to talk about my experiences just developing Blazor server applications. But in general, I want to touch upon some of the key things that I think are important to a technology-first business when you're transitioning from, let's say, a startup or so to an enterprise company. Number one is that your data is going to be your currency, right? You understand that data quality is important. You need to invest in technology to actually support that. Although, your resources may be lacking when it comes to architectural implementations or some of the more advanced, implementations that smaller companies go through. You understand as well that in the future, eventually people will need to get data outside of your database. You need some form of way via what most people would use an API to actually allow your consumers, whether they're systems or users, to actually get that data do business with that data, and then most importantly, as a company, your API program needs to be of a high quality so that people know that they can do business with you. And then when you go and actually extend or onboard people to that API, that program's there to actually support you. And then there's this final concept that starting your enterprise journey does not actually have to equal business stagnation, right? You don't have to stop developing features. You don't have to pause on everything in order to constantly add what I like to call the plug and play enterprise stuff that ultimately companies like Microsoft and Postman support. So like I said, so many resources can be dedicated to implementing, complex architectures, right? There's no point in going for microservices if you don't need it. There's no point in going, over engineering for stuff if you really just don't need it, and it's not the current business need. So I like to prioritize under engineering. I like to prioritize what's the business need, and how do we prove out that concept very quickly. So greenfield projects, whether it's a risky project, using some of these plug and play enterprise capabilities will actually set you up to be able to iterate very rapidly. So we're starting brand new application, greenfield project. Team is very familiar with .NET. There's a particular concern on security, ease of development, and what I think is the best scenario for this is what's called the Blazor server distributed monolith, right? Blazor server is very unique because you can actually, the entity framework, right, your data access layer can talk directly to your components, right? So you don't actually need an API controller in between that. And that's very important because let's say you have, 24 CRUD resources, right? Most of those may not actually need to be exposed. Nobody's trying to get the data out of the database via API. It's really just, UI data. And so why do you have to add, web API controllers when you don't need them? So few key points about Blazor is the robust JavaScript interoperability. So you can call JavaScript from .NET, you can call .NET from JavaScript. People are very nice and they wrap native JavaScript libraries for you in .NET, so you can just use them as Blazor components. Supported by .NET Core, scalable in real time, most importantly through SignalR, right? Scalable through SignalR via the Azure SignalR service, and then real time via SignalR, obviously via WebSockets, right? And then there's this controllerless architecture, right? We talked about this, don't need controllers, and you have this restless UI, right? When you're developing a web API, you may be familiar with some of the patterns like clean architecture or the end tier, way of designing your APIs. And this actually does not change, right? Your controllers, as we see in the minimal APIs in .NET 7, they should be very thin, right? They should not contain any business logic. They should not contain anything. And so theoretically, you design your business layer and your data access layer, and then let's say you need to move to APIs, it's very easy to add a controller on top of that. Two important things when it comes to developing an application, right? You may want to support system integrations where, for example, a client credential bearer token comes in and starts to read data. You may support implicit flow applications where users try and read data. So it's very, very important to be able to kind of support different workflows, which we'll go through as well. Another cool thing about Blazor Server and Blazor in general is that if you have existing assets, whether they're legacy XML APIs or REST APIs, you can use those existing assets that may have dozens of years of business logic built into them, and actually just migrate the front end framework, right? So you come from legacy technologies, whatever you've used in the past. It's very easy. And so if we look to the right side, I want to highlight some of the plug and play functionalities that Microsoft provides, and how easy it is to actually spin up a enterprise grade Blazor application. So from the deployment side, we come to Azure App Service, right? We're going to go into the Visual Studio Connected Services button where you can basically deploy an app service without having to log into the Azure portal. Azure Functions, if you do eventually want to expose those APIs. Azure Pipelines is very easy to set up for CI/CD. We talked about SignalR, real-time and scalable with Azure SignalR service, and then WebSockets for real-time communication. Monitoring is a big one, right? You want to make sure that you know what people are doing in your application insights, and that telemetry client that can be injected into your components allows you to track page clicks and events and custom metrics and all that stuff. Identity is very important when it comes to small companies, right? Azure B2C user flows is a great option if you want to just set up a very basic authorization method. If you have additional requirements related to authorization, Microsoft provides custom policies and the identity experience framework. So that's the more advanced version, but pretty much can do whatever you want with that. On the security side, I really like the concept of Azure Managed Identity, which is basically assigning an identity to an Azure service and allowing them to communicate very securely. And then obviously Key Vault's integration with both your app service as well as your Visual Studio makes it very easy to onboard developers. You don't have to give them any secrets. You don't have to do anything. You sign in with Visual Studio and you add them to the Key Vault access policy, and you're good to go. So that's just a quick highlight of the services, that are basically plug and play when it comes to Visual Studio. And this is the connected services button that I was showing. You can find this in the startup project. There's, one of the first ones is connected services. And you can see it basically walks you through how to set up an app service, how to set up Azure AD B2C, right? Signing into Visual Studio is very great because you can add somebody to your Active Directory, give them Key Vault access, tell them to sign into Visual Studio, and they can pretty much run your project. I mean, it's very seamless in that regard.
So real quick here before we move on, Garrett, we had a few questions come in the chat. So Narnia Expert asked you mentioned API quality. So in terms of quality, what are some things that you look out for in terms of what makes an API high quality versus low quality?
Great question. So I don't know if we've all had experiences where you go and call an API and you kind of assume things. You don't want to go through the whole Swagger document. So maybe you type v1/user, right? And you may not know whether the service provider provides a plural or a singular, HTTP URL or endpoint. Whether or not they provide a post search with a request body or a get search with query params. It's not about whether, it's less about whether one API is quality, because when you integrate with one API, it's very easy, you have the docs. But when you have an organization with dozens or hundreds of APIs, that consistency across the organization is actually the most important thing. And we're going to touch upon that in the later segment of the API governance, right? And so ultimately that is API governance, is ensuring consistency across APIs as much as you are ensuring consistency within one API, right? Because, as .NET developers, we have our validators, we have our extension methods, and we have all these things that help us enforce the quality of the underlying business logic or the implementation of that API. But when it comes to having hundreds of APIs across your organization that ultimately all produce that open API specification, and then consumers auto-generating code from that specification, consumers auto-generating collections from that specification. So we're going to see a ton of that a little bit later. What this line of business application is doing is actually rapidly iterating so that you don't need APIs. And then eventually, once you expose those APIs out, that's when we start to converge on the quality conversation. So this is going to be a very short demonstration about Blazor Server, just to emphasize that you don't always actually need APIs. And part of being a Postman is trying to understand the value of the APIs, right? So if you're a team of 2-3 people, chances are you're probably all up to speed on what does that API look like? How do I consume it? What authorization do I use? What is the underlying business logic? Am I going to get a 400 by sending this model instead of that model with different validation? So which is why I kind of want to do this journey from line of business application with a couple developers, and then you move on to more of an enterprise and say, okay, we're starting to onboard dozens of developers. We're starting to move to dozens of microservices. How does my approach to API quality change? So yeah, great question. I hope I covered that, but trust me, there's a ton of information left in the talk. So another cool thing about Blazor is the support of .NET Core on the left, right? You use all the NuGet packages you're familiar with. There's a ton of UI component libraries like Syncfusion, Telerik by Progress, DevExpress, Radzen, ton of UI component libraries that are used. So we have this greenfield application. London Food Corporation's trying to create a new app. We're trying to support implicit flow, client credential. We have a team that specializes in backend .NET Core web APIs and lacks full stack experience. So what do we do in this scenario? I defined a kind of example architecture that I would do where the UI component libraries actually allow you to innovate very rapidly because it's pretty much just like writing HTML. And once you learn the on-click handlers, and once you learn the binding of Blazor, you can pretty much spin up things very rapidly. So if you look here, we have this UI project. These are going to be your Razor files. It's going to be your code behind. You have a web API that you may want to expose to your client credentials or your enterprise applications. And then your UI, everybody connects through B2C, right? This UI provider, this view model concept is very important because the one thing you need to make sure when you develop a Blazor app is all of your business logic is actually extracted out of the code behind, because those code behinds are partial classes, right? So you want to be able to move those out to more of a view model. I call it a UI provider, call it whatever you want, right? Ultimately, you can expose resources through web APIs. You can expose resources through the UI via dependency injection. But ultimately, they will point to, like we talked about earlier, defining that application service layer, defining that data access layer, to ultimately be able to do whatever you want with, right? Whether you want to move to all APIs, whether you want to move to no APIs, you can do that. So some quick benefits and drawbacks. Some benefits for a small project, everything's in the same solution. You don't have to open, a dozen microservices to make a change. You can support both implicit flow, client credential flow. You get via the web APIs, you get the benefits of the ASP.NET Core request pipeline. So much easier than to integrate things like Serilog or middleware, as opposed to a Blazor server project where you don't really have control over that HTTP context after the initial load. So obviously some drawbacks to that to this as well, right? The server side rendered application does cost more in terms of hosting, right? Server rendered. If you have more memory intensive applications, like for example document loading, that will cause a strain on your servers as well. Obviously you can use JavaScript interrupt to actually offload a lot of this stuff client side, but that's something to keep in mind. Drawback again is a growing domain model. I mean, keeping all this stuff in one solution with an ever-growing business is not always a great idea. So defining those layers inside your application is equally as important. From my experience, there's a little bit more tutorials on WASM, WebAssembly Blazor, and then the constant drawback we hear is that a Blazor server depends on the constant WebSocket connection. I find for line of business applications, for non-critical applications, non-geographic applications, whether all your clients are either on the intranet or in the US or et cetera, it's not a problem at all. So now I guess what are the next steps when you're developing this application? If you want to stick with Blazor server, you can, if you're 100% confident that your database is not going to be exposed. You can continue to use dependency injection in your server and your components, and basically continue with this restless architecture, right? If eventually your consumers want to read the resources, then you need an API layer regardless of whatever protocol you use. And the next steps also are, you've proved out your concept. Either, let's say you've identified a business need where you want to convert it to WebAssembly, or you want to take advantage of .NET 8 with this Blazor United approach, as well as the support for GRPC and .NET. So a ton of different things you can do. Like I said before, people are very nice and wrap native JavaScript libraries for you. And then, hopefully not, because you've had so much success with Blazor, but if the business actually requires it, then just move all those web APIs out and spin up a new React front end, right? So it's all about your business needs and what the needs are for the future. But setting up this platform for rapid iteration with Blazor Server allows you to pretty much do whatever you want in the future.
Garrett, I have a question for you. I see you called
Sure.
out there's GRPC support in Postman now. As I recall, that's a newer feature. Is that correct?
It is, yes. So we just released gRPC support a couple months ago. I would recommend looking at the Postman blog. I think a few of my teammates are watching. If you could put a link in the comments, otherwise I'll find that blog article for you. But .NET obviously providing a ton of support for gRPC with the JSON transcoding coming out in .NET 7, I think. So Postman's equally supporting on the gRPC side with we have tests now that you can actually write against your gRPC requests. So we're moving into the multi-protocol landscape, and that includes GraphQL, right? That includes gRPC. That includes, for example, maybe we have async API in the initiative. So ton of different protocols that Postman's looking at as people just continue to evolve.
While we're on the topic of
Sure.
gRPC, we do have a question from our friend Fuel Snable. I'll put this up on the screen here. Question is, can gRPC support in Postman work without the schema?
Good question. So my understanding right now of the current gRPC support is that you do have to use that protobuf definition. And by uploading that protobuf definition, that allows you to actually send those gRPC requests. So I think we do. It's kind of like that GraphQL introspection, right? It's different because you can send GraphQL requests, but it's kind of like using the protobuf file, we can create those gRPC examples and requests. The example response is a very, very cool feature of gRPC. It will actually fill in faker data. And you can send random requests. I'm not a 100% gRPC expert, so I would just suggest reading the blogs. I think you're gonna have a little bit more success
Thank you.
on the Postman website. So let's assume that we've identified we want to move into a microservices architecture. We're onboarding dozens of developers. Our product has succeeded. We've had this Blazor server application in production, and so now we want to develop this API program. And so what happens now, right? So as .NET developers and maybe .NET Core Web API developers, we're very experienced with Swashbuckle, with those annotations, with creating that open API specification from code, and that's what we're going to get into. So whether or not you develop your applications database first, code first. I think one thing that .NET developers can kind of agree on is that we're more comfortable writing C# than open API specs. And that's perfectly okay. But the question is, how do we take advantage of this .NET code first and code led way of developing and actually incorporate and shift left in terms of governance, in terms of how well my consumers will be able to call those APIs, et cetera. So just some high level notes about Postman. We have this concept of the API builder. It's a different part of Postman. It's right below those collections. And it allows you to hook up source control. It allows you to hook up test and automation. And we're going to go over a lot of this, as well as collaboration between consumer and producers via commenting, forking, and merging, ton of different other stuff. So from the consumer side, you have mock servers. We're going to go through those. API client and SDK generation from third-party tools, and then documentation as well. So let me go into Postman right now and just show you where everything lives, and then we'll continue with the talk. So you may be used to the collections tab. I have created an API actually called the weather API. I just used the standard boilerplate. Didn't want to overcomplicate it at all. But actually, if I go to my definition, you'll see I have a Swagger JSON file here. And so in this API, within the API builder, I can actually look at the entire specification. I can look at all my paths, all my DTOs, et cetera, right? Important thing to note from this API itself I can actually generate a collection from the Open API definition. So this is automatic collection generation using that definition that was uploaded. And the question is, where does this definition come from, right? Do I have to copy paste from my Swagger URL and copy paste this definition? I don't. So what I'm going to show you is something cool that we've built related to API governance, related to API management within Postman and within Visual Studio itself, right? So one thing I want to talk about is Postman's governance capabilities. So the API specification requires a level of governance, and this is what I was talking about of even just something as simple as making sure all of your operations have summaries. This is something that gets translated into the Open API definition when you use, for example, Swashbuckle, right? So Postman supports what's called spectral rules, and a spectral rule is basically just a open source linting engine where you can define custom rules against a basic JSON document, which in turn ultimately ends up being this Open API specification. And you can define this at the team level. What are the rules that I want to enforce across my entire enterprise? So this is actually this is actually a Postman Enterprise feature. A lot of what we will go through is not a Postman Enterprise feature, but this is going to be important for the next command that I show. So the question is, how do we actually shift this process left into Visual Studio, right? Because when you actually make a change, let's say you make a change to your API controller, that affects the Open API definition, whether you change the response model, whether you add documentation, etc. So how do you know whether that Open API specification is actually in accordance with whatever Postman rules you've set up, whether it passes all the collection runs, etc. Postman provides what's called the Postman API. And so it basically allows us to lint a local JSON file. So this JSON file is our Open API specification. And so by calling Postman API lint, I can actually see in Visual Studio whether or not my linting has failed. And so you can see here that I defined two routes, and I'll go through this, but let me just touch upon this MsBuild command. And so if you're not familiar with MsBuild, MsBuild is actually a event that's defined in the CS_proj file of your application. And so what it does is it defines a post build event that actually can return an output. And so we're using the .NET command line tools, and we're using a NuGet package actually called Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core CLI. And this is basically Swashbuckle's CLI tool to be able to generate a swagger.json file locally within the output path of your Blazor project. And so what we're doing next is we're just logging into the Postman CLI, and we're actually just linting that document. So I'm going to move over to Visual Studio in a second, but just one quick takeaways. The most important thing that I want to emphasize is that your Open API specification before in a traditional .NET Core Web API workflow would not actually be exposed to the source control process, right? You don't know what the changes are on that specification as a result of your code changes. That specification being produced in the first place allows everything like what we talked about before with auto generation for consumers, with mock servers, documentation, example request responses actually coming from your code, right? That produces response type annotation. It's plug and play for producers. If you want to monitor those APIs, we've seen people run contract tests on consumer-driven contract tests, as well as documentation. Again, one secret on the user's local machine, and that's it. So I think we've all heard enough slides. I think let's go to Visual Studio and see what's going on. So we have right now, we have a Blazor project. I'm probably going to get a lot of comments on how I chose to architect this thing, but what I want to do is I want to just go over the project itself, and I think it will relate back to a lot of what we've seen. So the first thing I want to do is go to this Razor page. And so this Razor page is very simple. It basically just has a button that adds a date, and you see this injected service, right? This is using, this is going to be using dependency injection, right? There is no API call being made in this Razor page. And so if I go to the implementation of this, you can see it brings me into what's called the weather forecast service, where I have a post create, right? this post create actually communicates directly with Entity Framework. No API call. Now in this service as well, I've defined a get forecast, right? And so where are the references here? The references are in a actual controller. And so this is a great example of one method in my business service is using data dependency injection. The other one is actually hooked up to a controller. And that controller can be found in my API controllers folder. So we have two endpoints. And so these endpoints will have get and get without summary in order to demonstrate what this governance check looks like. So let me just run this project. I'll show you what it does. And it's very, very simple. Don't make fun of the design. I'm not an expert, but one thing that I will say is it's very easy to integrate Tailwind CSS into your project. So if you are a design expert, let's see, start up very quickly. Okay, cool. So remember, this primary button is using dependency injection. So if I click, hold on, it's lagging, sorry. If I click, you can see I have two records here. It was inserted into the database. And if I go over to Postman, I actually have a collection that will allow me to get these records. So if I go to here, you can see that it's returned those two records that I've inserted. So it's just using a very, very simple in-memory database. If I go to this database context, you can see we're just using an in-memory database. Now, what happens when I make a change to my API controller, right? The API controller is responsible, and ultimately with Swashbuckle in that program CS, we have add Swagger gen, which is responsible for generating that Swagger document. And then you see here, it's the use Swagger UI, right? And the use Swagger UI is going to be that /Swagger that everybody knows and loves, right? But a lot of people actually aren't comfortable using this in production. So what happens is they end up creating external documentation that they have to manually update and yada, yada. But ultimately, you do have that open API specification to take advantage of. Regardless of whether you're displaying it in the Swagger UI, you still have it, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to show you how this works quickly. So in the unit test project, keyword in the unit test project, because I don't always actually want to generate the Swagger document. I don't always want to run my linting rules. So if I actually want to just build the project, for example, the UI project, it will not run this post build trigger because the projects do not have a reference to the unit test project. So when I trigger the build, it actually will not run the unit test project. So you can see that in a second. Let's wait for this to build. Perfect. So you see that 4 projects succeeded. And this is important because we have 5 projects in the solution, right? And so now if I rebuild my unit test project, or sorry, if I rebuild the whole entire solution, then every single project should run. And so you'll notice something interesting once this happens is that MsBuild event will actually perform those actions, right? So it will produce the open API specification. It will log into the Postman CLI, and it will actually lint my open API document. So you see that I've logged into the Postman CLI. Hold on. Perfect. So I've logged in successfully to the Postman CLI. Let me just turn off my virtual background because it seems to be lagging a little bit. Okay, perfect. So what we've done is we've actually linted this open API specification. So you see this Swagger JSON file, and these are actually my custom spectral governance rule sets. And so you can see that all 5 of my projects succeeded, right? And that's because my open API specification that was generated in the Swagger JSON file now complies with whatever rules I've set up in Postman. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change in the weather controller. I'm going to get rid of this summary. And so if we saw before, remember this endpoint needs a summary in order to comply with my API quality checks. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try and run my unit tests. And what I would expect is that these unit tests do not run because my controller now violates what my organization has said are requirements for my API. And so we log in, we'll do the check, and you see that the build has actually failed. And if we skip down here, we'll see one succeeded, one failed. And if we just search for the error, we can see all your operations need summaries right here. So just by removing the XML documentation on my controller route, I was able to check whether or not this produced open API specification is in accordance with my rules before I've actually pushed anything to Git, right? And this is what I was talking about when the Swagger JSON file is actually able to be diffed, right? This was not possible within Visual Studio before the swashbuckle ASP.NET Core CLI NuGet package. So it's very cool to see if I click on my weather controller, and honestly, I just added this back, which is why, but you see that I've removed my summary. And now in the associated Open API definition, the summary has been removed as well.
That's really cool. I can see that being useful. I do have a question about this.
Sure.
So if I wanted to extend that idea to some other element in the XML docs, how would that be accomplished? For example,
Great.
Any parameter that is passed to that method must be
Great question. Yeah. So for example, we have the produces response type annotation. This allows you to define the DTO that's actually being returned by your endpoint. So I mean, Swashbuckle basically picks up on all these annotations and it will translate it into your Open API document. I'm not as familiar with the depth of the XML documentation, but all you really have to do to enable that is in your add Swagger gen, you can actually enable XML documentation right here, include XML comments. Some additional information here, for example, my organization requires me to define a contact, a security definition, and a security requirement. Let's just say that there was some custom, Open API extension you use, AWS exposes extensions, ton of things you can do with the specification. What you can do actually is you can add what's called a document filter. Document filter is an interface that you can implement anything you want to add to the Open API document. And so this is exposed via the iDocument filter interface. Another one is the operation filter. Operation filter is saying every single endpoint I have, I want this attribute to be added to the Open API definition for each endpoint, right? So it's pretty much up to you how you want to control this Open API specification inside of your code base, right? And it's very nice, for example, when you have dozens of controllers and you have the documentation right above it. It's very easy to collapse if you don't want to look at it, right? I don't know what everybody else uses. I use Control MO in order to just collapse all this stuff. But yeah, very easy. Makes it easy to document, right? And so let's move into Postman from here, because the question is, how does it fit into Postman? And so the Swagger JSON file ultimately is going to be committed to Git. And so if we go to the API builder here, you'll notice we have two integrations. We have a connected repository, which means it's hooked up to GitHub, and you can see this. Repository here. In my main project, I have the Swagger JSON file, which is actually being tracked by Postman. It's being tracked in the definition itself, right? And so I can see in my native Git support what changes were made on some of these commits, right? So I'm going to show, for example, this one. Let's pick this one. Swagger JSON file, view diff. So I can view in Postman what the diff was on the specification as well. A cool thing about source control is when I push my Swagger JSON from Visual Studio to obviously to a feature branch. We're gonna do this in master for the time being, but when I push it, this Open API specification is automatically correlated to where it falls in my repository. So the spec here will be updated in Postman. The associated documentation will be updated as well, right? You have these nice documentation viewers. You can define the security scheme, etc. As well as keeping a collection actually in sync with that Open API definition. So that's something that kind of is outside the scope of this, but let's go back to the integrations, right? We can create branches within Postman in order to actually make changes on the spec or make changes in Visual Studio to influence that specification, as well as the forking, merging, etc. process. Test and automation is very important because we want to be able to run this on CI/CD. We want to be able to run collections on CI/CD. And so if we go to the test and automation tab, you'll see that we have a bunch of different runs that actually will tell me my governance rule set violations. And you'll see that some of them failed because I've pushed that summary change, and some of them have passed by pushing that summary change. I have no collection runs for this build because there's no test that I can run against a local host. But if this were, for example, deployed to a live environment, then if I define tests at the collection, at the folder, at the request level, those will be actually ran as part of that CI/CD pipeline that you see in test and automation. So that's where you can actually run the collection as part of that as well. So we've seen things done with collection runners like consumer-driven contract testing or smoke testing, right? What's the purpose of creating a smoke test that's basically just a REST call in a .NET Core project? It's kind of over engineering if you ask me, right? And there may be certain use cases. For example, Postman doesn't support test assertions on WebSockets, so there are certain use cases where you can use an actual C# project to do those things. But for, let's say you have 200 endpoints you want to cover, most of them are just checking whether or not they're alive or not. So that's one thing we've seen with collection running, moving smoke tests out to CI/CD, moving consumer-driven contract testing out of packed into CI/CD, right? Using libraries such as AJV and stuff that can actually validate a specification without writing C# code, right? And so we want to make sure that every piece of code we write needs to be written at the same time. And so, yeah, generating the collection from that documentation from that specification is also very easy, like I showed, right? Generate from definition, it's right here. So as that specification changes, whether you have new consumers onboarded, whether you have different attributes, et cetera, you can then evolve those collections at the same time as the specification. One thing I'll note here is if you are in the, if you're on Postman Enterprise, we have a concept of the private API network. So when you do have hundreds of engineers, when you do have thousands of microservices, it's very cool to be able to publish this out to your consumers, right? So if I look at the read-only version of this, I can put release notes there. You can publish collections, and you can actually view the schema documentation as to what did the specification look like at this version of the API, right? And so, a lot of this is not filled out due to time and stuff, but obviously Postman's documentation, support is first class, right? It provides markup, code, GIFs, right? So it's very cool to make it interactive for your consumers after you've generated that documentation. And remember that all of the documentation you define in your controller and in your XML documentation can actually be added to the Open API specification and then translated into a Postman collection. So it's almost like the specification is the bridge between what you have in Visual Studio documented and what your consumers can see.
And quick question there. So as a consumer, is the additional documentation that you're adding on about releases and so on and so forth, Is that exposed anywhere, or do I need to be in Postman to be able to see that documentation?
So that's a great question. If we go to the Postman public workspace, Postman actually exposes a Postman API, right? So this allows you to get, let me go to the collection actually. So the Postman API allows you to actually scrape API definitions, API schemas. So you can get a schema, and actually, let's say you have an external developer portal that you want to integrate and integrate with. You can use Postman's API to scrape that schema, scrape that documentation, and then what this does is it actually returns a JSON response. And again, this is a very, very good example of setting up a consumer to be successful, right? When I was looking at this request, I had absolutely no idea what this API returned. But the successful response, which can actually be defined in your controller, can actually tell a consumer what should they expect when they look at this endpoint. And this, again, right, what we talked about is getting that schema, doing whatever you want with it, right? A very important thing that we did not touch on is the concept of mock servers, okay? So mock servers are very important for the consumption of APIs, because what it means is, it means that all of that business logic validation, those 400 errors that get returned from fluent assertions, or those 403s that get returned from the identity provider, all these things can be avoided when it comes to onboarding somebody to your API through what's called mock servers. And so if we, I don't have any mock servers set up right here. Let me go back to the repository. But what I can do actually is take this collection, and I can mock the collection. By mocking the collection, what it does is it takes the example responses defined. For example, I can add an example. I can specify what that example will look like in JSON. And then by clicking mock this collection, Postman will host my entire API, devoid of authorization, devoid of business logic, devoid of all the stuff that makes it hard for your user to use it, right? What this allows is, it allows people to just get familiar with what does the response look like and what does the request look like. But also, be able to successfully send a request. So mock servers are very cool for rapid UI development, right? Because there's no database powering the data. I can actually go straight into Postman. Let me see if I can find an example. I don't. Let's see, mock servers. Weather demo. Let's see. Should have one set up. This example response is actually would be returned from what's this Postman this mock.postman.io, right? So Postman provides a URL, and so if let's try it out. Let's see what happens. Perfect. So this is not a hosted service, right? This is something that I made up based on an open API definition. And Postman will, it's kind of rogue of me to try it live, but Postman will actually set this up for me based off my spec. It will use all the example responses that I've already defined in my controllers in Visual Studio. And like I said, if this required a bearer token, if this required any specific headers, if it required business logic in the request body, none of that would matter for my consumer. My consumer would immediately be able to, let me change this JSON. My consumer would just immediately be able to say, how do I design my UI to be able to handle what response I'm expecting? And it's, so many times do we hear, oh, my consumer can't generate an authorization token, and it causes days of basically synchronous blocking. And so what mock servers allow is, let's say you're not even actually developing a feature yet. And so if I go to collections, I go to this example response, my consumer just asked for a new thing called type. And I'm going to just do test. I got to add my comma. And now when I go back to this mock server, immediately there. So there's no such thing as saying, oh, I haven't deployed yet, right? Because if you have a mock server, you can immediately provide your consumers something to work against their front end. And the mock server does not actually have to be a Postman URL, right? You can use this as a CI environment or dev environment and actually host this on your gateway. Use whatever semantics, use whatever naming conventions you want, and use it as a pass-through mechanism. But ultimately, and here at Postman, we're trying to empower people who don't know how to code, right? So imagine being a product manager, an API, an API owner, or a business analyst, and you want to see what something looks like in the UI very quickly. Just add the attribute to your mock server. If you want to see what the UI does when you pass a negative value, just do it in your mock server, right? You don't need to set up pretty much anything except a open API specification, which we already learned is auto-generated from your code. So as C# developers, we're comfortable with C#, but that does not mean that we need to ignore this source of truth, this open API specification. Yeah, that's. I hope that clears things up from a mocking perspective.
That was really useful. Yeah, you had mentioned the ability to sidestep auth with this mock server, and there's a related question in the chat that I wanted to put up on the screen. This comes from our friend Surly Dev. How do I specify a bearer token in a request?
Great question. So let's go back to the other thing, and I do want to plug one or two more things. Okay, so there's a couple ways to specify a bearer token, and ultimately we can use the authorization tab, right? If we go to bearer token, we can either generate it and actually paste it, or we can use the OAuth client credential flow. So if we scroll down here, this is authorization code. If we go to client credential flow, it's basic client ID, client secret. When you get a new access token, you have the ability to actually use that in subsequent requests. There is an easier way, and kind of what I've seen is people will have a generate token request that they will use the same exact format, URL, client ID, client secret, but they'll actually store that in an environment variable or a collection variable. And so there's a very cool article. Let me try and find it. It's a OAuth 2 token renewal in Postman, and this is something that we're actually working on to build in the application. But Alan Helton wrote this very cool thing, which is basically just a pre-request script that checks the token expiration. It has your client ID, client secret, and it allows you to set the environment variables, the token expiration, and set the token as well. So there's like a ton of different ways to actually handle the bearer tokens. My favorite way actually is just increase the TTL of your identity server to like 60 minutes or something in the dev or QA or performance environments. And it'll actually allow you to just overcome a lot of these refresh token issues in general, because if you could just generate a token every hour or so, it's much easier than having that token expire in 3,600 seconds. So yeah, there's a ton of different ways to do bearer tokens. I personally like the token request, store in the environment variable, and then use in the headers like this, like just send key authorization, and then something like bearer token is your variable. So and then this is in every single one of your requests, or you can just define it at the collection level or the environment level as a variable, and then use it here. Cool. I did want to highlight just two things from a Postman perspective. I don't know if a lot of people are actually aware of this, but I've highlighted the Postman API. We have two collections that are very interesting, Postman to JMeter. And what this allows you to do is it takes a collection and it actually converts it into JMeter syntax. And so you see it's a JMeter test plan. And so this will actually, I'm not able to run it because it's a public workspace, but this will actually return a entire JMeter test plan associated with your collection ID, retrieved from, you guessed it, the Postman API. Another cool thing is the Postman to Markdown converter. And I did a talk on this, actually, collection converters, but this collection will convert to Markdown. It uses one of our hosted Lambda functions to convert a collection to Markdown syntax. So if you have an external developer portal where you host documentation, this is a great way to convert your Postman collection to Markdown. And then you can actually take an existing collection. So this is very, very cool because in a situation where you have multiple different consumers calling your API, and they have different requirements when it comes to request bodies, etc., you can take a Postman collection that was defined for a specific consumer and then actually generate an open API specification from it. So if you, let's say you've been developing in collections for 3 years and all of your business logic is built in collections, right? This is a great tool to actually start to generate specs from those collections. And you don't have to export a collection as JSON anymore in order to provide your consumers something. You can actually give them a spec. They can auto-generate code. They can auto-generate models, etc. So just these 3 collection converters, and we also do have a Open API Spec 2.0 converter as well as a 3.0 converter. But these 4 collection converters are very cool as well.
All right. Thanks for showing all of that. We do have one last question from much earlier in the show that I wanted to get to, and this comes from our friend David Pine. He was asking, I'll put it up on the screen, he was asking about GraphQL support. You mentioned this very briefly in the beginning of the show. Could you just quickly walk us through how that would look in Postman?
Sure. So there is a, I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to say, but there is a completely new GraphQL client coming out in Postman. So I don't believe I can demo it right now, but what we can actually do is we can create a API. Where am I? API. Where am I? Oh, maybe I missed. There we go. I had to scroll. Okay. The API is going to ask me what schema definition language I'm using actually. So create, and so I can actually specify protobuf, right, for gRPC. I can specify GraphQL schema definition language for GraphQL. I'll use a boilerplate. We can see we have GraphQL here right now. I don't think, let me see. Let's just play around with this live. Let's generate a collection, GraphQL example. We have our mutations and queries. And then this is exactly what I was talking about when I was saying the GraphQL introspection, right? The introspection has the ability to pull in your schema and allow things like, autocomplete, for example. Where is it? So autocomplete based on schema. But like I said, we're actively overhauling the GraphQL client. So within the next few months, I can get more information on when it's going to be released exactly, but definitely keep up to date with the Postman blog. Let's see if there's any new information on the Postman blog. But so this was just released by Sterling. You can actually start to see that we have a GraphQL echo server, which will, let me increase the zoom of this. You can see this kind of explorer capabilities of being able to select my schema, and then it translates into that request. I think we have support for subscriptions as well, so that's really cool to see real time. But the GraphQL client's being completely overhauled, so I don't want to say anything too much about it because it's actually incredibly exciting what we have in the works. So definitely look into that.
All right. So folks, if you're interested in GraphQL, do keep an eye on that. We're down to about 2 minutes left for today's show. Are there any really good resources that you would want to share with our viewers?
Yes, the Postman blog has everything. And the Postman blog, I would just search, like, for example, if you're interested in gRPC, you can look at, we publish tons of different stuff on multi-protocol, especially just because that's one of our main focuses. But if you're involved at all from a community perspective, we have the Open Technologies group at Postman who who's very involved from a GraphQL community perspective. So so that whole team is dedicated to open source and open technologies and just moving the ecosystem forward at the same time as coming up with some really, really cool features in Postman. So the blog is really where everything happens. Hopefully I'm going to have an article about this API governance stuff in the blog in a couple weeks. If you look, there's custom imagery for each blog, which I think is so amazing. Like they create a whole illustration just for each individual article, and everything is unique. And you can see Doc Jones actually is writing a lot of these GraphQL articles, who's actually the GraphQL lead for open technologies. So definitely take a look at some of these articles if you're interested in GraphQL. Definitely take a look at the Protobuf GRPC articles. Postman's coming out with new stuff every day. So,
all right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for tuning in today. Unfortunately, we are at time for the show. But as a reminder, you can check out other great .NET Live TV streams like this and videos over at dot.net/live. Next Monday, I hope you all tune in again. We'll be joined by guest Vincent Hugendorn, who will join the show to talk to us about microservices and modular monoliths with Microsoft Orleans. See all of y'all next Monday. Thanks again for tuning in and for the lively chat. Bye.
Thanks.
Wow.